Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this press conference of the International Observation Mission to the early parliamentary elections in Armenia. Thank you for turning out in such numbers. Thanks also to those of you who are following us online. We very much appreciate your interest. We'll begin with some remarks from the heads of delegation up here on the podium, and there will then be plenty of time for your questions. There is simultaneous translation between Armenian and English, so you'll be able to put your questions in either language. We begin with Kari Henriksson, head of the delegation from the Osce Parliamentary Assembly. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you, dear Katya, and good afternoon, and thank you for joining us here in Yerevan, as well as online. Please note that I will speak also on behalf of the Special Coordinator and leader of the short-term OSCE Observer Mission, Ms. Margrethe Cederfelt, who, due to the sensitive political situation in Sweden, had to return to Stockholm before an important parliamentary vote today. First, I want to emphasize that this International Election Observation Mission is a team effort between the OSCE ODIHR and OSCE PA and the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. The OSCE ODIHR mission here in Yerevan consists of a core team of 11 experts and 26 long-term observers deployed throughout the country for several weeks already. In addition, we are extremely glad that we are going back to normal, so to say, with our election observation missions, as the OSCE ODIHR was able to deploy over 200 short-term observers throughout the country for the first time since the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. We also bring together more than 100 parliamentary observers from OSCE Parliamentary Assembly and the Council of Europe Parliamentary Assembly. It has been a pleasure to work with my colleagues George Katrougalos as well as Owen Murphy, the head of the team of the ODIHR. I believe that despite challenges posed by the pandemic, the fact that we are here in such strength bears testament to our commitment to and solidarity with the people of Armenia. Our overall conclusion is that the 20th June 2021 early parliamentary elections in the Republic of Armenia were competitive and generally well managed with a short time frame. However, they were characterized by intense polarization and marred by increasingly inflammatory rhetoric among key contestants. The legal framework is generally comprehensive, but the fact that amendments were adopted so close to the elections caused some legal uncertainty. The election administration conducted its work in a transparent, collegial, and professional manner and enjoyed electoral stakeholders' confidence. Voters were provided with a broad range of options, and fundamental rights and freedoms were generally respected, with contestants being able to campaign freely. However, the negative tone and the personality-driven nature of the campaign hindered a policy-focused debate. Generally, women were sidelined throughout the whole campaign. Election day, including the vote count, was assessed positively overall. After these overall conclusions, please let me use another minute to add some remarks in my capacity as head of the OSCE PA delegation. It has been a pleasure leading our delegation of 73 observers from over 24 countries. The majority of our observers assessed overwhelmingly positively the administration of the elections, including on election day, despite the limited time for the implementation of the recent amendments to the Electoral Code. Also, while the recently introduced electoral changes have resulted in larger representation of women in the candidate lists, they remained largely absent from the public discourse during this campaign. It is important that women are not just equally represented, but are also given the opportunity to engage actively in public and political life. Before I end, I would like to thank the Armenian authorities for inviting us to observe these elections and for the assistance provided in all organizational matters, as well as for the warm hospitality of the people of Armenia, especially in the polling stations yesterday. Despite the hot weather, and this is not coming from me as a Scandinavian and a nurse, but many poll workers were conducting their work wearing masks throughout the entire day. I know how warm that can be. So I highly recommended your work, which is essential to conduct proper elections. And yet, let me also say that I have witnessed many polling stations that were not independently accessible for people with disabilities. This is not a minor matter, but a matter of fulfilling democratic ideals, as everyone should have equal access to cast their vote. I will now give an opportunity for my colleagues to speak, and I look forward to any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We now move on to Mr. George Katrougalos, Head of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe's Delegation.
Many thanks, Chair. As Kari has said, we are here in a collective and collegial mission. So I'm going to speak only complementary what has been already said, which has my approval. But allow me, I'm obliged to do that because I'm coming from Greece. Before proceeding to the institutional assessment of my organization, the Council of Europe, to say at a very personal note that I should convey to you the brotherly solidarity of the people of Greece to the people of Armenia in these harsh times of difficulty. We are with you. The Council of Europe is the guardian for democracy and human rights in our continent. Armenia has joined our organization in 2001, but we have been following the elections since 1995. We have celebrated the elections of 2018 as genuinely democratic. We are following since the evolution of the democratic reforms in your country. Our delegation is representative of all political parties that participate at the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. And we represented 13 different European countries. Our assessment is what that despite difficulties due to the compressed time before the snap elections, despite a very polarized political climate, we had elections that have been held fairly well and without any compromise to their democratic character. And that, of course, does not go only to the day of the elections, but to the pre-electoral period. We have seen some minor technical irregularities in some poll stations, some overcrowding, the non-possibility in some of them for people with disabilities to have access, but this did not in any case put into question what I said before regarding the respect of the democratic order and the constitutional order. Coming from a country that it has itself a very polarized political life, I would like to stress the fact that on the aftermath of the elections must be considered as given. Whoever does not win at the elections has a chance at next elections, not to question the validity of the results. This is a prerequisite for a smooth functioning of the democratic institutions. So, I really believe that despite this especially polarized political environment of the pre-electoral period, we are going to have a full acceptance of the elections by all political parties, exactly because the elections had the institutional characteristics I mentioned before. I will prepare the final report of the Parliamentary Assembly at the Council of Europe on the observation of these parliamentary elections, because this is the way we are functioning. We have a full democratic debate among all our members when we assess elections in our country. And as I said before, we try to follow the elections not just at the moment, the Sunday of the vote, but as institutional whole. And I hope that what we have witnessed these days, the smooth functioning, despite problems that have been already mentioned, are going to characterize the political life of the Armenia also in the days to come. Many thanks.
Thank you very much. Finally, we move to Owen Murphy, who heads the Election Observation Mission from the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Katja. And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for attending this afternoon. I'd also like to thank the Special Coordinator for her leadership role in this International Election Observation Mission, as well as to thank my colleagues here on the podium, Carrie and George. Thank you for your assistance and for your hard work. Our team of experts began our work here in Armenia more than 1 month ago. And I would like to thank the Armenian authorities for the invitation to observe these elections and for their assistance during our stay in this country. In that time, we have had long-term observers deployed in every part of the country observing the election process. And it's important to emphasize, as George has, that an election is far more than just one day. That is why we have been here to observe the entire process leading up to yesterday's vote, including the pre-campaign period. And we will be staying some time to observe the finalization of results and the resolution of any complaints and appeals also. This week, as you know, we were joined by a team of short-term observers from the OSCE participating states, and we have joined forces with observers from the parliamentary assemblies of both the OSCE and the Council of Europe. And with more than 300 short-term observers in the field, we were able to make a comprehensive assessment of these early elections. And I want to use this opportunity as well to thank those parties and alliances, as well as organizations and institutions that we met during our time here for their cooperation. The first point that I would like to make is that at no time were we obstructed from doing our observation work by any of the state or local authorities. This was also true when it came to our election day observations. In fact, the administrative authorities worked openly with us at all times. We also engaged with members of civil society, as well as with representatives of the political parties and alliances contesting this election, and all of these engagements were professional. In short, the observation mission was able to do its work, observe in an independent and impartial manner the extent to which these elections were conducted in accordance both with national legislation, but also in line with international commitments that Armenia and all OSCE participating states have entered into. And I'd like to now mention briefly some of the things that we have observed in this period. Candidates could campaign freely throughout the election process, and fundamental rights and freedoms were generally respected, and voters were provided with a broad range of options, leading to a competitive election. The late adoption of amendments to the legal code did create some legal uncertainty, and did impact upon administrative areas like training of officials and voter education. But the legal framework is comprehensive overall. The election authorities delivered on their mandate professionally and enjoyed the confidence of stakeholders, and the process was generally well managed. There were many accusations levelled by political contestants at each other, accusations of improper or illegal conduct. These accusations, combined with increasingly inflammatory rhetoric, served to draw attention away from more substantive issues. But they also intensified the polarisation that characterised these elections. And this atmosphere was not constructive to informed public debate. I'd also like to mention that while we recognise the important improvements and laws to increase female participation in Parliament, as Carrie has touched upon, women tended to be sidelined throughout the campaign itself. This does not lend itself to increasing female participation in public life, notwithstanding the improvements to candidate quotas and placement on candidate lists. Another aspect of the campaign worth highlighting is in relation to campaign finance laws. While there are detailed campaign finance laws in place, these laws do not cover every aspect of campaign expenditure, for example, organisational expenses, and this creates opportunities to circumvent campaign spending limits. It's also contrary to repeated and long-standing recommendations from both ODIHR and the Venice Commission. And when we look at the media landscape, we see that it is diverse. But there are concerns which continue to be highlighted to observers regarding political affiliations of certain broadcasters. We also noted a number of recent instances of physical harassment of journalists, which raises some questions about respect for media freedom. The ODIHR Election Observation Mission commenced its media monitoring on the 24th of May, with both quantitative and qualitative analysis of 7 television channels, including the public broadcaster, 1 public radio station, and 3 online media outlets. Our media monitoring showed that several broadcasters made a visible effort to cover a broad range of electoral contestants, contributing to the information available for voters to make an informed choice. Several newly established parties claimed a lack of coverage by traditional media and opted to use social networks instead. Election day, including the vote count, was assessed positively overall. But like my colleagues, I want to highlight issues around voter accessibility in polling stations, as well as some procedural matters around overcrowding and attempts at interference by some as issues which need to be addressed for the future. To come back now, if I may, to some essential points that are worth repeating and which George and Carrie have already stated. The election authorities delivered on their mandate professionally. All candidates could campaign freely throughout the process, and voters were provided with a broad range of options. But the highly aggressive, personalised and often accusatory style of political campaigning overshadowed opportunities for more substantive public debate. And I'd like to emphasise that the election is not yet over for us as observers. Of course, to ensure that we have the fullest possible picture of the election environment, we will remain for some time to follow the developments after the election and observe the complaints and appeals procedure. All this information will feed into our final report, which we do expect to complete some 2 months from now. And before I end, I'd like to acknowledge the hard work of the team of experts that I have had the privilege to lead and work with, as well as our local staff, who have been so committed in their work throughout. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Now it's your turn. I'd just like to say at this point that while everybody here and those who are listening online are very welcome, this is a press conference and we will only be taking questions from journalists. I'd therefore be grateful if you could introduce yourself and the media outlets that you represent before voicing your question. And the microphone is over here, so to my right here. As I mentioned, we do have translation, so you're welcome to ask your question in Armenian or English. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Liberty Radio, Anush Makarchan. Local observers have identified that on the day of elections and before the day of elections, they have identified, they received calls about bribes, and though they mentioned that they did not have any decisive or determining effect on the final result. But have you seen or have you heard of the problem? May you tell us that whether it can have any impact on final result? Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you very much for your question. We have heard allegations of certain activities taking place, certain abuses in terms of the electoral process. We're also aware of isolated incidents, isolated incidents being reported. Anything that we observe or that is claimed to us, we of course take very seriously and we review thoroughly. But it's also important that the authorities where official complaints have been made follow up on those complaints, and as part of our work we will continue here to monitor that complaints and appeals process, and that will then feed into our final report, which will come in 2 months. But in terms of what we saw, again to repeat on election day, we saw that procedures were followed. We saw in the polling stations that the election day procedures and the vote we could assess as generally positive. And if I can just let you know in terms of the amount of observers that we had, we visited more than half of the polling stations in the country. So we have made a very good assessment in terms of our ability to be in each of the regions and in as many polling stations as possible. We remained for the counting process and for tabulation as well as part of our observations, and that was done in accordance with procedures. So again, to come back to what we said in relation to election day, we had a generally positive assessment of what happened in polling stations. Thank you.
Sorry, they cannot have any influence on the results of the elections. These cases cannot have influence on the result of the elections.
I think in terms of the complaints that have been officially filed, it's important to actually see the substance of those complaints, what they actually were, and how they are adjudicated upon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please go ahead.
Հայկական ժամանակ, or Armenian Times Daily. Tell us, please, whether there were cases when the secrecy of ballot was violated. For example, have the observers seen that? And if they have, what happened? Were there any interventions on the part of the responsibles in precincts? And there were also different calls from precincts related to some conflicts inside. Have you been studying those? Meaning quarrels, disputes.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the second part of your question? I lost the translation for it.
Yes. There were calls on the election day from different precincts related to violations. Some disputes. No, you can't hear the interpretation? Okay.
I can start by answering the first one with secrecy observed. So I can say that there were reported very few observations about secrecy not being kept. In some cases, the head of the PEC were addressing it, and it was solved on the spot. And as observers, we do not interfere in anything. We observe and we report. So we are not interfering in any of the election processes.
So on the election day, there were calls from different precincts about violations. Have you been studying those?
Thank you for your question, and I can hear you just fine now. Thank you. So in relation to, just to explain a little bit about what our observers were doing in terms of the short-term observers that were deployed to more than half of the polling stations in the country, they would have spoken to the chairperson of each polling station and would have been informed of any issues or problems that that chairperson might have had in that polling station. And then, of course, there's a procedure by which a complaint can officially be made or escalated up to the Territorial Election Commission. And we would have been made aware of that as well in our observation mission. And any incidents would have then been reported either to the Central Election Commission. And we do in our report, and you'll have a chance to look at a copy of it, detail those instances where they occurred, where some may have occurred. Thank you.
Thank you.
Emilio
Please, go ahead.
from CivilNet. My question is two-pronged. First, there was a lot of talk on social media about power outages going on in several regions. I was wondering if that talk about power outages, how the OSCE and Council of Europe observed that, if that came in. The other one is about during the campaign, the use of administrative resources by the ruling party, if any discrepancies were noticed with regards to that as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can you please repeat the first part?
Was on social media last night, there was a lot of talk about power outages going on in several regions. I was wondering if that was observed, what you can tell us about that.
Thank you for your questions. I think I can answer from our observers that we were not going into the social media issue when we observed the election in the polling stations, and then we have reports from the stakeholders which are informing us what with different difficulties or challenges regarding social media and other things. So I think if you, Owen, could elaborate a bit.
Thank you, Carrie. I mean, in your question in relation to power outages, where these may have occurred, they did not impact upon our observations. So it's not referred to in our report in terms of our preliminary findings. But of course, as I said, our work isn't finished here, so we'll continue to do that work and produce a full report in about 2 months. Again, we would have heard allegations of abuses of administrative resources. Where those allegations were made, of course, we took them very seriously. But it's also important that where there are serious allegations, that those complaints would have been made to the relevant authorities, and it's for them to follow up those allegations. From our point, though, the electoral process as a whole was generally well managed. The legal framework we talk about being, generally comprehensive, and on election day, there was an overall positive assessment of what happened, and that is the general impression that we have of the election. So while, yes, these allegations were made, and it is for the authorities to investigate incidents reported to them, and we'll monitor how those incidents are handled by the authorities as part of our follow-up period after the election. This was a generally well-managed process. Thank you.
It is exactly as my two colleagues have said. The only thing I would like to add is that we had allegations regarding misuse of power or undue pressure, coming not just regarding the incumbent, the government, but also from parties of the opposition, regarding, for instance, instances of undue pressure in the military or even in the private sector. And exactly as Owen has said, all these allegations, regardless from what they come, should be investigated by the state authorities, the competent authorities. And myself, I have the conviction, like Owen, that it did not have such an influence anyway at the result.
Thank you very much. Next question, please go ahead.
Good afternoon, TASS News Agency. Could you assess the elections as free and fair and as valid? And the second question, how many breaches of electoral law have you fixed during the, yesterday? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for attending yesterday. I think when we were out visiting polling stations, I think we might have had the opportunity to bump into each other. And thank you for your two questions. The first question, to be quite clear, our responsibilities here are to observe the electoral process and to make an assessment of that electoral process, not just against the laws of the country, but also in relation to the international standards that Armenia, as all the OSCE participating states, have signed up to. And we're independent and impartial in the work that we do. Generally, it was a well-managed process, and that's what we are saying in our report today. And we've assessed the election day positively overall. You asked another question in relation to breaches of the electoral code. And again, it comes back into the realm of where there are allegations of people breaking the electoral law, or where there are even complaints filed. While we will obviously look at that ourselves thoroughly, and we take it very seriously, the actual complaints, the actual incidents are for the authorities to investigate. And so the work that we do as observers is to see how those complaints are filed, to see what then happens with them in terms of the complaints and appeals procedure that's here in the country. And that's why we remain on past election day, so that we can do a full assessment of the entire electoral process. And, work that is not found in the preliminary statement today, because it is the day after the election, will be in the final report in just a couple of months. Thank you.
May I ask one more question? Yesterday, there was a power outage in many regions of Armenia just when the elections was over. How could you assess this, and could this affect the counting of the votes? Thank you.
Thank you. I think I already answered that question, and to kind of repeat my point briefly is those stories or instances of power outages did not have an impact on our observations, so are not referred to in the preliminary findings. But of course, we continue here and will continue to do our observations, and that extra period will lend itself to further work in the final report.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions here from the floor? I don't see any. In that case, we would go over to Zoom. If there are any questions online, I don't see any. No? Your last chance to ask questions here? If there aren't any more questions, please go ahead.
Armenian Times Daily. So, I just wanted to know whether there were any violations during the count of the votes.
We didn't get the question.
Well, I think Carrie explained it to me, sorry. I think your question was about violations in relation to the counting. And again, when you look at the preliminary statement, and I do hope the translations are available when you're leaving, and our assessment of the election day procedures. The election day and the vote, we had observers there for the opening of ballot boxes. We had them visiting polling stations throughout the day for the closing, for the count, for the tabulation. And as I might just repeat again, we visited more than half of the polling stations in the country. We assessed everything as generally positive, and in relation to the counting process and the transparency and everything that happened around that happened in accordance with the procedures that were there. These were our observations.
I want just to add some specifications in order not to give you the idea that we are avoiding your questions. We have already said that the assessment of the elections is generally positive. We have also said that the competent authorities, the Electoral Committee, the commissions at the poll stations have done their job to the extent that we could observe. And exactly because Armenia is a democratic and sovereign state, it's up to these authorities to fully investigate individual incidents that could have taken place, and we have taken note of them. But the fact that we considered that the overall electoral institutions have worked is the reason that we are not expanding our answers. To be more concrete, if we had reasons to believe that the Central Electoral Committee or any other administrative instances did not do their work, we could not, of course, correct it, but we could observe it and take notice of that. We did not have such an assessment. That's why our consideration is fully reflected to what has been said by my two colleagues, and this is the reason we consider the overall result as generally positive.
Just for summing up, can you make some parallels between the elections in this year, in 2018 and 16? Can we say that this is a step forward or a step back just between these two elections, if we compare 2018 and now?
Just a very short answer from me first. we seldom compare elections because the situations are so different and the circumstances are always different. But I can say that, for instance, some recommendations that we have done, like enabling more women to participate, they have been doing that in applying a law that say that you should have more representative women on the lists. So that's an improvement. So there are some improvements, and also after this election, the OSCE PA would like to have collaboration with the OSCE members in Armenia to discuss further recommendations and how we can follow up in a partnership to reach the goals and the recommendations that we are delivering in this report.
As I said before, we have a report voted by the plenary assembly after every elections. And I can tell you that the assessment of the elections of 2018 was very positive. They have been considered generally democratic and in progress. They have made some progress regarding the smoothness of the procedure and the other aspects that correspond to international and constitutional standards regarding previous elections. I cannot tell you what is going to be the new report, but I personally believe that these elections have been like the elections of 2018.
I might just add to that, my two colleagues, just to say that, you know, we're aware obviously that there's been a period of reforms in relation to different laws around the electoral code in this country for a number of years. Even the way in which the elections were held, the way that people cast their vote was a new reform, and we know that there are more reforms to come. But in our report we also talk about, and I mentioned in my earlier contribution, where recommendations have been made by ODIHR or by the parliamentary assemblies of the OSCE or the Council of Europe or indeed the Venice Commission around areas, for example, campaign financing, where we look forward to developments in the future.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you. Please go ahead.
Past info
Asmik Koshkaryan. My question is the following. Have you recorded such or noted abuse of power, specifically in the statements made by the representatives of the ruling party, mostly addressed to the opposition? Thank you.
Thank you for your question, and again, I'm sorry, I don't know why. Actually, as I look at my two phones, maybe that's interfering with the audio. I beg your pardon. So, if your question, if I'm correct, was about the misuse of power by state authorities, I think your question was in relation to, and I might just come back to something that George was talking about earlier on, and some of the other questions related to, which was in terms of any allegations that were made. I mean, allegations have been made. It's been in the public domain about the abuse of administrative resources by both the ruling party or the incumbents and other parties. Those allegations have been made against a number of different parties, in fact, and we have taken those allegations very seriously. And our work in that respect feeds into the preliminary findings that we make today and will feed into the full report. But where there have been reported violations brought to the attention of the authorities, our role is to observe how those violations may or may not be handled and then report on that. But George also earlier, when he was answering a similar question, or maybe it was the same question, talked about coming back to our overall assessment of the election, which said it was generally well managed, people could campaign free and fairly, and freedoms were generally respected. And that was an important conclusion that we wanted to make. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If there are no more questions, I see there are still none that have come online. Then I would thank you very much indeed for your interest. The statement with the initial findings of the International Observer Mission are outside in both English and the Armenian translation, as are the press releases. They will also be available on the OSCE website shortly. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.